So today's event hopes to draw together some of the amazing work that's been done around race and global supply chains. The framework of racial capitalism helps orient us not only towards an entire class of low-wage workers of color in the global South, but also to the profound investment in whiteness consolidated at the very tops of global supply chains. I have long admired J.J. Rosenbaum's career as a movement lawyer and organizer who has always put issues of race, nation, and labor in conversation as the founding legal and policy director of the National Guest Worker Alliance and the New Orleans Workers Center for Racial Justice. Currently, as the executive director of Global Labor Justice and International Labor Rights Forum, JJ works closely with the Asia Floor Wage Alliance to advocate for garment workers, arguably from below, working closely with advocates and organizers throughout Asia, rather than turning to global north human rights norms or corporate-driven senses of social responsibility. GLJ's campaigns and research built out of a visionary model of solidarity have amplified workers' concerns and applied strategic pressure to global brands. And I look forward to hearing from JJ about the best ways that we can continue to build on this work. These tensions between global and local advocacy concerns are beautifully exemplified by Dina Siddiqi's scholarship. For years, teaching anti-trafficking courses that hope to look critically at how the so-called movement against modern-day slavery has gone wrong, I and students have loved reading Professor Siddiqi's seminal article, "Do Bangladeshi Factory Workers Need Saving?" which draws our attention to how misguided efforts to rescue workers undermine solidarity with worker resistance. And today, Dina will also share some of her latest research published this past summer on the unique impacts of COVID on Bangladeshi garment workers. Lastly, Minh-Hà books, articles, and op-eds always manage to juxtapose some of the most startling artifices of fashion, race, and inequality to reveal the systems that undermine efforts towards achieving justice. This past summer, Professor Pham's article, "How to Make a Mask, Quarantine Feminism and Global Supply Chains," illustrated the forceful collision of the pandemic and pervasive racial inequality by asking why Etsy mask makers in the global north were celebrated, revered, and highly well compensated as the creative heroes of the pandemic, while garment workers who make these masks as a vocation were so devastatingly ignored and continue to face harrowing working conditions. Professor Pham's analysis compels me to share one final disconcerting juxtaposition to launch our discussion that was shared to me recently by the Federation of Garment Workers in Myanmar, a newly formed union that's just about 1 year old. This past summer, around the same time that Guess Jeans, like other fashion brands, including Gap and H&M, committed to donating $1 million over 5 years to the NAACP as a demonstration of their commitment to combat anti-Black violence, one of their subcontracted factories in Yangon, the Amberstone factory, dismissed 270 workers suddenly, stating reasons due to COVID-related supply chain constraints. But out of a total employee base of over 800 workers, these 270 were the workers who had most closely on forming a union in the past year and had, before their firing, already reported violence, threats, and harassment from management to stop their organizing. In appeals to Guess Jeans, FGWM has found an unwillingness for the brand to look into the virulent union busting and other labor abuses at Amberstone. And I'll share some links to their advocacy campaigns in the document of links and resources that Soraya has helped us compile for today. So in our discussion today, we're interested not only in the new nodes of power and vulnerability that alert us to systems of racial capitalism that drive the consolidation of wealth and power, but also the very misguided notions of white saviorhood that underlie recent attempts at remediating labor abuse in global supply chains. In the spirit of conversation, we want to encourage the audience to use the chat Q&A function throughout the event. After each presenter offers some introductory remarks, we'll open up the floor to what I hope will be a vibrant Q&A that can also function as a group brainstorm of best ways to move forward, shifting from a consideration of sources of vulnerability into a call to mobilize around new leverage points for power. And is on that note, with great pleasure, that I welcome our first speaker, Minh-Hà Phạm, Associate Professor in the Graduate Program in Media Studies at the Pratt Institute. Welcome, Minh-Hà.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I thank you, Elena, for inviting me to this event, and to Stephanie and Trey for organizing us. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Dina and JJ today. I also want to thank our host, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. So, like everyone on this panel, and probably like many of those watching this event, I've been following, studying, and learning about the devastating impact of COVID-19 on garment workers around the world. And my research is especially focused on garment workers in South and Southeast Asia and in California. So what have we learned in the last 9 or 10 months of this pandemic? We know that Western brands across budget and luxury sectors, from H&M and Gap to Balmain and Oscar de la Renta, canceled an estimated $40 billion worth of orders from garment factories. So in other words, this isn't just a fast fashion problem. This is a global fashion problem. Many of these orders were canceled while they were in production or after they were already produced. Some of these orders had already been shipped when the brands canceled. Worse, brands refused to pay for their orders, or when pushed, demanded discounts between 10 and 25% off on orders that were produced already at rock bottom prices. Western brands' murderous disregard for the lowest paid workers in the global fashion supply chain, the vast majority of whom are women and girls of color in and or from the global South, directly led to what's been widely characterized as a global humanitarian crisis. In short, when brands don't pay factory owners don't pay workers, and workers suffer. The Clean Clothes campaign estimates that these cancellations amounted to the theft of about $5 billion in workers' wages. And as staggering as these numbers are, they don't include home workers or other workers left off of official factory payrolls. They also don't account for outstanding overtime pay and severance pay. As a consequence, during a global pandemic, garment workers and their families around the world are going hungry, are going without adequate medical care, are being evicted from their homes. Many are going into deeper personal debt, trying to put food on the table and a roof over their heads. And too many garment workers have died because of the lack of all of these things, and or because they're forced to take jobs that put them at a greater risk of illness, not only COVID, but other kinds of illnesses as well as an array of race and gender-based violence. What we've also seen during this pandemic is increased media and social media attention to the global garment industry. Too often, as I've pointed out in some articles I've written in the past, garment workers are invisible, even in news stories that seek to highlight labor movements and essential workers. So I was happy to see more mainstream attention given to the impact of COVID on garment workers, even though media interest now seems to have waned in the last few months. We're also seeing growing calls to reform the global fashion supply chain. Generally, I'm sympathetic and supportive of these efforts, but I'm also concerned that some of these reforms obscure and even unintentionally legitimize the exploitative conditions that constitute the global fashion system. For example, I'm seeing an overwhelming and almost exclusive focus on pushing individual brands to pay for their canceled orders. The focus on specific corporate actors individualizes what is actually a systemic problem. The mass cancellations weren't the result of a handful of individual brands acting badly. In fact, they were acting within their legal right, at least as far as they interpreted their contractual agreements, which include clauses that offer the possibility of canceling orders and even dropping suppliers altogether. These are entitlements that Western corporations lobbied for politically for decades and have enjoyed for a long time, well before COVID. So reforms that focus only on individual brands and that don't implicate state actors, international trade organizations and agreements, and local factory owners, some of whom are also government officials and so have a vested interest in keeping their workers' wages low, not only gives Western brands too much credit, it also fundamentally misunderstands the interlocking relationship between corporate, state, and local government sectors. The mass cancellations in the early days of the pandemic and what we're seeing now, some are calling it the second wave of cancellations, aren't really about individual bad brands behaving badly. They're the direct consequence of international and frankly, corporate colonial trade arrangements and organizations that were established some 30 years ago. International trade liberalization laws, global trade organizations, and domestic labor laws dating back to the late 1970s and early 1980s and 90s created the structural conditions that made it possible for Western brands to seek out and then abandon at will the poorest workers in the world and from the who are from the poorest countries in the world. In other words, the cancellations happened because the supply chain and international apparatus constituted by unequal trade and labor relationships and ratified by laws that structurally favor Western corporations and corporate logics. These cancellations happened because the global supply chain, a long, dense, and convoluted network of relationships, an apparatus built by 30+ years of racist and colonial ideas about women of color, about poor women, about women's work, and then encoded into international law, worked as it was designed to work. Reforms that treat the supply chain as if it's just in need of fixing or improving, making more transparent, for example, misses the point. And worse, it legitimizes the racial capitalist fashion system as basically okay, but in need of tweaking rather than dismantling. So when we blame brands for the pitiful state of garment work, we're only attending to part of the problem. Brands do what they do because government actors and institutions have worked in implicit and explicit ways to support and protect these corporations. To offer another example closer to where I grew up in Southern California, California garment workers are still paid under the piece rate pay system, which is essentially wage theft by another name. The piece rate system means that garment workers are paid for their output, paid for whatever pieces they make, and that amounts to about $5 an hour in a state where the minimum wage is $12 to $13 an hour, depending on the size of the business, and which will increase to $13 to $14 an hour next month. Again, California garment workers aren't subject to wage theft because a few bad brands are misbehaving. It's because the piece rate pay system, which is legal, right? And also because California legislators who had the chance last September to overturn this system by passing SB 1399 or the Garment Worker Protection Act failed to do so. And hopefully they'll do so when they have another chance at passing SB 62, which is the revised version of the Garment Worker Protection Act. But we'll have to see. And here I want to shout out the Garment Worker Center in Los Angeles, whose members are, in my opinion, helping to define and shape the international women of color feminist movement for sweatshop abolition. So to conclude, I want to end with a provocation that maybe something we can take up in the discussion or in the Q&A. Almost every popular idea for reforming the global fashion system is limited by its failure to take serious account of fashion's particular form of racial capitalism. From the exclusive and uncritical attention to fast fashion, to the push to make fashion magazines, runways, and executive offices more quote unquote diverse. These reforms don't challenge, much less dismantle, fashion's racial capitalist system. They accommodate it and often legitimize it. I want to suggest that we push beyond the goal of getting brands to pay workers their owed poverty wages, that we turn our political, intellectual, and creative attentions to interrogating and dismantling the broader political, economic, and social conditions that make it okay for workers in a $2.5 trillion industry to be employed at poverty wages in the first place. Finally, we should also think very seriously about the structural conditions that make poor women and girls of color in and or from the global South disproportionately, and in some cases almost entirely vulnerable to the exploitation and harm done by Western state and corporate alliances. And I didn't have this, but I want to add that I think we should also think very seriously about consumer-led movements, which I know are doing some important work. But Elena, your class on the white savior complex is making me think that this is something else that we need to put on the table, right? That these consumer groups, which are often multicultural, but are very much Western, based and Western centered in a lot of ways, maybe taking up too much space in the conversation, right? So I'll stop there and I'll hand it off to my co-panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Minh-Hà. Next up, we'll welcome JJ Rosenbaum, Executive Director of Global Labor Justice and ILRF.
Thanks, Elena. And it's really an honor to be on this panel with such brilliant thinkers about, I really appreciated the point about the interlocking relationships between state, capital, and corporations. And I think that I want to talk a little bit about how this is both a very disturbing time, but we're also seeing movements based very deeply rooted in garment production countries led by women, many of them former garment workers, who are agitating us to do this work differently. I hope we can see through that a little bit more and therefore be able to participate and support that work, not only in California, where the Garment Workers Center is just changing the discussion in really important ways. So echo the importance of knowing them and supporting their work, but also how that's happening in different production countries in Asia, both at the national level and also in regional efforts, which are essential, I think, as we see the competition that gets created when states have to compete for the lowest cost of labor, and some of the ways in which garment workers themselves are creating transnational demands to try to overcome that. The first thing I wanted to say also is just start with a really basic question that's about how information is kept, because I think this, to me, has been really illuminating in understanding the limitation of some of the very important and well-meaning work that's been done. In April of this year, the Asia Floor Wage Alliance, which is a regional network of garment production unions in South and Southeast Asia, and worker and feminist support organizations, put out a demand saying that during the quarantine, before the end of June, which they did this during the quarantine, the garment workers would need at least 60 days of wages to survive. That was their assessment from hundreds of conversations. And that is very minimal survival, but no less than that. And it was an agitation to governments, suppliers, brands, whoever, that money had to come through as most of the factories were shut down. And then that it also had to be paid through existing employment relationships, so that structure of employment was protected, and that as rehire started happening, that it had to be safe in the way that garment workers defined it, and that it had to include all sorts of precarious workers as well as the traditional employee-employee relationships, and that there couldn't be union busting. So this is a very basic demand. That could be layered along with paying contracts and raising standards and many things, but also is the very urgent demand. Workers always have urgent and structural demands. It was the very urgent demand. And thus far in the conversations we've had with many of the major brands you would think of, I have not talked to a brand who can give that data. Like, they do not actually know how much workers got paid during a set of time in the quarantine. It's just not how they track the information. So I think even at the most basic level, we do not know. Like, there's been a lot of attempts to do research and assess, but the brands themselves are not actually caring about that question. They're looking at the contracts, they're looking at all these corporate structures. And I just think at a very baseline level, this is a structure that says, irrespective of the country that you're in, we can ask this will enable people to survive. It'll strengthen the institutions that they have in place. It'll enable those institutions, those unions, to be at the table around national structure, national government policy for workers, et cetera, that was not able to be leveled broadly and uniformly. I think that we also saw national policy, particularly in India and Indonesia, to permit companies to pay workers lower pay, to cut overtime, these like very basic structures that happen. And this was, again, without a question of whether the brands themselves were making money. And many of them have made a lot of money during the COVID period, it turns out. Many of them also had made a lot of money in prior years and given that back to stockholders in dividends and stock buybacks, and these very important ways of taking money out of a company and giving it back to make it look like there's no money now. So I think a second piece that has been really important is that sort of how to read SEC sheets, how to put this information back in the hands at the local level, so that national governments can have a conversation with national unions and regionally about how to get that money back to the global South, is really fundamental. And those of us that are in the advocacy world need to be paying attention to that. That's the way that there can be agitation around a different kind of policy level, by understanding where the money is. And the trade agreements are a layer of how that moves. In addition to that, I think the third thing I would say is that that is the nature of the extractive supply chain model. That is it is doing what it is designed to do, which is like find the lowest cost environmental regulation, labor regulation, et cetera, pull the money out and redistribute it to promote inequality. And so we shouldn't be surprised that it's happening. We should, of course, we're going to skirmish with it and we're going to have some wins and some losses, but unless that system is fundamentally reorganized, then that will continue to happen. And things like the pandemic are an example of disaster capitalism that will enable it to happen much faster, just like Hurricane Katrina was in New Orleans. And we will see exposed even more so the underlying inequalities that existed, but we will not fundamentally change it. I think the opportunity is that there are different kinds of alliances and different kinds of movement building that's possible in this moment where many, many things are laid bare. And we have seen different kinds of campaigns and alliances in places like Myanmar and different production countries that are very hopeful in my mind. And we have seen some wins when the fights are very specifically about getting workers reinstated. And I just want to say, I think this has been a big part of the fight in Myanmar. It's been a big part of the fights that we're supporting. I think we have to not be confused that like policy issues are bigger than like whether we can get workers, whether they're workers who expose sexual harassment or workers who expose wage theft or workers who want to join a union back to work in their position. Like that is the fight for institutions and organizations and movement building. We won that for 8 workers this week in India. It took an international campaign, and an organizer told me that it was the first time in 10 years that workers who had been retaliated against to be able to be reinstated in their unit at their same job. I mean, that is what we're up against. And that's a country that has rule of law, as we would all understand it, but in particular production countries, these are the fights. So I think the structure of how we show up in the fights as, we're a white woman-led DC organization that's actually strengthening the fights of unions, like locally, nationally, regionally, in a way that enables them to fight national and global policy fights is super important. The final thing I wanted to say is just that I think that that we also have to, I think the point about the brands being, I do believe we have to fight brands. I think we cannot be confused or disaggregated into a bunch of fights that aren't adding up and enabling us to actually understand what's going on and fight the policy change that's real too. But I also think that we're in a moment of changes in capitalism among many of the brands that we have to understand and be in alliance with folks that are fighting Amazon, for example. And we can't, push Amazon to pay the contracts and then declare a win against Amazon when we all realize that in order to fight inequality and decency and the things that we are for, Amazon has to be broken up, not added to the top of a supply chain where Amazon is the boss of Nike, is the boss of somebody else. And so I think this is a real moment to consider how garment workers are in those intersectional fights for a very different system. And I think I've seen more openings for that than there have been in the past. So maybe I'll stop there, and I'm really appreciative of the work of my co-panelists and excited for the discussion.
Thanks so much, JJ. JJ has directed us to a really vast list of resources that Soraya has compiled. Also responding to a panelist question, I have included links to both articles, Professor Phạm and Professor Siddiqi's articles at the bottom of that list. Okay, and our last speaker, please welcome Dina Siddiqi, Clinical Associate Professor in the Faculty of Liberal Studies at NYU.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Elena, for organizing this amazing conversation, and Stephanie, Trey, Soraya, and everybody else and the center for hosting us. What I want to do today, first I do want to take a moment to share my screen. Just there, and maybe I will go to a picture of women organizing there, and I will put it, okay, I will stop muttering. What I'd like to do is pick up actually perhaps on some of the points that Minh-Hà made and relate them to what was just said right now. So step back in time a little bit, thinking about liberal reform regimes and this individualizing of structural and global problems that we see. And I think Bangladesh, what I will speak about will be very much more specific rather than general. But Bangladesh is a very good site, partly because it's become a kind of what one person called an aid lab. It's a place of experimentation for all kinds of global trade rules, whatever. So it's interesting to think about all of the issues that we've just heard in the last two presentations through the prism of Bangladesh. And there have been two key moments of rupture. The first was I think everybody will know this, the 2013 Rana Plaza collapse, the building collapse that led to the death of 1,100 workers, right? This intensified the global gaze on Bangladesh, and it produced a global arrangement called the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, which was seen as a game changer. It was multi-stakeholder. It was the first legally binding agreement that included the voices of unions. It was modeled as it was dubbed as the new CSR model that could be used in other places, right? And what it basically did was, brands who signed on to the Accord would pledge not to have contracts with factories that didn't meet certain standards of fire and building safety. And of course, this was actually a really important move because there was, this was a key issue that was addressed. What the Accord, and it was so celebrated at the time, but what the Accord left out was, it basically left out the power asymmetries along the supply chain, the dynamics within the supply chain. And it did it, so the responsibility for the collapse was basically passed down the supply chain to the local, quote unquote. And the framing through which the problem was understood was both localized and depoliticized. So the reasons for the collapse became, and these are true, of course, shoddy building material because of corruption, corrupt government officials giving permissions when they shouldn't, a lack of oversight, all of that. But the understanding of why Rana Plaza happened was very much, it was culturalized. So the local became pathologized. So it was framed through this narrative of third world backwardness, of a local supply chain lacking ethicality, right? It was an ethically deficient local. And so the corporation then comes in with their, or the agreement comes in this amazing, one could argue, in this imperialist mode to try and fix the problem. And for all that people were saying this was a multi-stakeholder thing, the government of Bangladesh and the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers Association, a very powerful, very not worker friendly, I understand, association, they didn't have anything to do with it. It was just, there was nothing, national sovereignty simply does not count. It was all about trade laws, all of the stuff that I think Minh-Hà was talking about was definitely there. So the problem was discursively contained within the territorial boundaries of Bangladesh. And this kind of spatial containment displaced questions of accountability further up the chain. You didn't have to, and in fact, the brands, and I know there are huge differences between the budget brands and the luxury brands, but the structural conditions that produced the Rana Plaza collapse are completely covered over, because you have to remember, instead what you have is, as one of my intellectual collaborators in Bangladesh, Hassan Ashraf calls it, you have all the focus on the failed building. It's the building that failed. So the building is weaponized. But the root causes of why so many workers died that day had to do with why, you have to ask why so many workers went inside the building even though they knew it was dangerous. And why did managers feel they had to force workers to go when the banks in that building, the shops in that building, everything in that building had closed down except for garment factories. The desperation and I'm not trying to be sympathetic toward the owner of Rana Plaza, but there is the fear that he would, if he did not make the shipment on time, he would have to pay for all these goods that would be lying there, right? And for the workers, it was the end of the month, and a regular practice in Bangladesh is people don't get paid until the very end of the month. And the workers had been told, if you don't show up, you are not going to be paid for the last 3 months of overdue wages. This is very routine. So they all went in, but these are the kinds of things that are not there. So these are the kinds of things that the accord could not, even if the accord had been implemented perfectly, these things, these larger global structural issues would have remained intact, right? So now coming to COVID, what's happened between the COVID years? I want to start with what's one thing that happens between 2013, after the Rana Plaza, until 2020, January, say. Brands took this opportunity of Bangladeshi companies' desperation to basically force down prices. And I have this here, and I don't want to go too much into it. There is this very interesting person, Mark Anner, who's written tons about it, and he's actually done the math, which I don't do. So that's there. But it is interesting to see between 2013 and 2017, the price for the same product, without having the price of raw materials go up, actually went down, the price at which brands bought it. So Bangladeshi factory owners were squeezed, and what did they do? This is something I mentioned in my 2009 article, which began to happen after the 2008 recession, is that they pass on, they compensate by cutting down on workers, increasing production targets, basically intensifying, speeding up work, all of these things that they do. This is classic, there's nothing new about it. Okay, and now this thing is not working. Okay. So what the COVID thing shows us is, so I do want to, you did say I had 15 minutes if I wanted to take it, right? So,
yeah.
Okay. So it turned out, I started this morning and it just began to expand. So the accord had a curiously obscuring effect because the enormous sort of stress, what I wanted to say is that the stress of global activists on the accord crowded out other problems. And I was in Bangladesh in 2014, and it's interesting, there was a huge hunger strike happening in 2014, just a year after the Rana Plaza collapse, one of the most interesting things about it for me was that it was almost barely covered in the global press. And it's interesting to think about why or how. So, but the point here is that there was a striking disjuncture yet again between global left-wing activists pressing for brands to sign the accord and local progressive left-wing groups who were struggling a little bit with the accord, but with a whole bunch of other issues that actually had to do with the kinds of things that Minh-Hà brought up, the arbitrary dismissals. Right? It's so hard, or not arbitrary, I meant to say retaliatory dismissals, right? Which we see again on COVID has happened. So there's that disjuncture. So a lot has changed since 2013 in terms of factory safety and fire safety. A lot of the much of the structural stuff has not changed. And what COVID has done, one of the things COVID has done is Bangladesh, I've just put the sign here. It looks like a sign for an ambulance, but it's not. It's, well, as you can see, and I got this off the internet, it was an ad for a company that makes signs. And I thought it was very interesting that this is the one that they put on the side of vehicles. And it was interesting that this was presumably in high demand. So this is what, they do. So, and why? And this is from a story from NPR, which tells you don't really have to read it, but basically the garment industry is so important to the Bangladeshi government, or it says, people say it's so important that factories, trucks carrying finished garment products to the ports have special facilities, have the same right to the road as ambulances. This is actually important. So you see all of these things, import. And why is this important? This is important because right now, post-COVID, I won't go into all of the suffering, it's very similar to what you were talking about, what both of you were talking about. But what post-COVID, what the government and the very powerful employers lobby has done is they have, in order to keep factories open, for a certain amount of time, they deemed garment workers, without using the word, essential workers, because there is already this idea in the national imaginary. This is emergency export duty. I mean, it's very interesting to think of where the garment factory fits in discursively and how policies then are then laid out. So COVID, I think there are a couple of good things that have come out of the pandemic, and I'll end with them. The first thing that the pandemic has done is that it's punctured a set of liberal and imperial myths around neoliberal capitalism and third world women, that is around the racialized bodies of women in the global south. These myths are common sense and dangerous because they produce popular consent. In a place like Bangladesh, they produce consent for conditions that are otherwise deeply exploitative. So if you are going to unpack the discursive logic, then you have to, I will come across a lot of very well-meaning Bangladeshi middle-class feminists who don't know about the industry, who will tell me, why do you always attack this industry? Which is not what I'm trying to do. But it's good for the women. We see our women on the streets. We see, and of course, at the individual level, sometimes some good things are happening. So the myth of neoliberal empowerment of women, especially in this case of Muslim women, lifting their families out of poverty through factory work, most recently embodied in Nike's Girl Effect initiatives, has been undermined a little bit. Okay, I think, or perhaps I am being very optimistic. But I think for brands have justified this narrative of lifting women out of poverty is something that brands have used over and over to justify this minimum payment, exactly what you were talking about. Minh-Hà, right? But I think the myth of ethical business is going to be needed to be rethought just a little bit. Brands who've broken their contracts and refused to pay for goods already ordered, produced in Bangladesh, have made clear where their priorities are. So laboring brown bodies are valuable at one point in time, and those very same laboring bodies are completely expendable within 2 months, right? And I think that it's going to be harder to sustain this business ethical myth. I don't know. But related to the myth, neoliberal free trade, again, you know, this idea that, and I know lots of people have written about it, but certainly in the development saturated world of Bangladesh, there is this idea that there is something called free trade, even though there, you know, there are all of these, the idea of free equal trade has been really undermined through this. Now everybody knows this thing called, this clause called the force majeure clause, which is apparently, and I had never heard about it until now, which is apparently allows brands to exit from contracts under certain conditions. And of course, they're the ones with the lawyers. They're the ones who go to WTO or wherever else and do these conditions. And I want to say a place like Bangladesh, capitalists in Bangladesh, the government in Bangladesh really are in unequal positions compared to companies, the big brands, as well as places in, you know, countries like Europe and America. So I think the North-South tension is something we need to take seriously. Finally, I think we're going to move, hopefully we're going to move away from the unquestioning acceptance of corporate benevolence, which is there. You go into a Whole Foods and you get asked for money to, you know, give to some girl in Pratt in Bangladesh, you know, whose life will change. So the pandemic has laid bare the extreme power asymmetries within the global supply chain. I think what we need to change, because long before the COVID crisis, while companies were giving money for training on sexual harassment or maternity payments, all of which is good, they were also pushing down buying prices. They were doing both at the same time. And we need to really once more go back to problematizing this corporate social responsibility as we're thinking about things. I really think we need to, I'm speaking for somebody who works not so much globally as in Bangladesh, we need to dismantle this myth that the myth of development, the larger myth of women and development, we need to go back to that, where somehow, as you say, an individual company, whether it's in Bangladesh or whether it's in the United States, is the problem, because they're all within this larger system. I just want to say there are so many, right now, there are 3 different things in Bangladesh that I'm, you know, I know that are going on. One, this is Taslima Akhtar, who is this, actually, she was the one who photographed the photo in Rana Plaza that became so iconic of Rana Plaza, of the couple in an embrace. I don't know if you know about it, but she's a labor organizer, and she's been organizing these women in this factory called A1 who have not been paid for 9 months, and they have been out on the streets for 9 months. That's one thing. And it's interesting, I really felt, I told her, she emailed me this thing. She actually now has coronavirus too, but of course she would look at her. These signs are in English precisely because I think there is an idea that the global attention has a certain kind of local pressure, right? There's more, I'm following this. This is the Communist Party of Bangladesh, very obscure, but it actually does organize people. And these are also people who haven't been paid, and they're in front of the Labor Directorate in Bangladesh. Anyway, I hope I haven't taken too much time, but I will end there.
Thanks so much, Professor Siddiqi, and all 3 of our panelists. We have a pretty robust set of questions. I could group them thematically, but I think actually building right off of the compelling images that we've just seen and the provocation of how useful English language slogans continue to be for people advocating for their rights in the global South, I think we can maybe address two of these and ask everybody to weigh in, because we've had a really interesting discussion on the different kinds of culpability and maybe leverage between the state and policy and or corporations. And then lastly, the idea of consumers. And then there's also a question about ethical consumption in there, but possibly tying in two questions. The first, how do you all envision brands and individual consumers' role in making the system equitable and sustainable? These are political and system issues, but should brands and consumers really wait for international governments to reform policies? So maybe built into that question, do you see like the state and private sector as distinct, or what is the relationship between those? And then related from Sophie Kendall, do you think that change will come from social pressure on brands or from government legislation for brands? Where do you think the real pressure comes from, and which do you see as more effective in eliminating unethical practices in the fashion industry? So wondering from each of you if you have seen examples of state pressure that has been successful. So in my line of work, we see the vociferous rise in so-called modern day slavery legislation that demands new forms of transparency, which I thought Minh-Hà offered an excellent critique of, everything hinging on transparency as the panacea here. But do you see other examples of legislation in your own work that's resonating locally or globally here? And what is the relationship you see between maybe governments, brands in the private sector, and then lastly, consumers? We can get to consumers in another question as well.
I would just say, I think it's a both and. I mean, and I think we're all in different positionalities. Obviously, we have to fight for finding public written agreements with capital that are effective along the transnational and supply chain world. So that's not corporate social responsibility or sustainability practices or gender practices or hiring an NGO to do something nice for women. Like, that is not that. It's collective bargaining agreements where they can be enforced if there's a problem, and legislation that can be enforced. And I think what we're seeing is that to Professor Siddiqui's point about the force majeure clauses is there's a power element to all of this. So you can have, the highly contractualized market of contracts between suppliers and brands, which seems like a rule of law-ish lawyered up process. But the history of force majeure clauses is meant to actually be a protection for suppliers. Like, say you're a supplier in Bangladesh and you can't get the cotton from where you're supposed to get it because of COVID, then you don't have to produce what you said you would produce. The history of the law is not for these brands to just say, crisis, we're off the hook. And I think what's been interesting about this is some of the contracts have come to light, which before they had not, because again of the power dynamic. No one supplier, even if they have I'm sure there are many great lawyers in Bangladesh and many courts, but they're not going to go to court against a brand because they'll never work again. Like, that's the power dynamic that holds this stuff in place. And so it turns out it's not even just the force majeure invocation. The contracts are fundamentally unconscionable. They're more like our cell phone contracts. You just get it, it says what it says, and you sign it in order to do business. They're like fundamentally unconscionable. And they say things like, the legal equivalent of, you will produce these shirts for us at X dollars, and we will buy them if we want to. That's it. And that, so it's not, so we need that. Just because it's written on a form and it's signed and all doesn't mean it's rule of law or it's enforceable. So I think there are also important ways in which we have to reimagine the legal system so that it's not either you're trying to litigate one supplier at a time, that contract in a production country, in a court that can't get the information from the brand about how and why that happened. Maybe if we could actually move enable the brands to show up in those courts and be powerful, that could be an interesting experiment. Likewise, transnational jurisdiction. I'm a believer we have to try a lot of different things right now, that there's not any one right answer. But I think similarly, the CBAs, you have to be able to enforce them. If you have a collective bargaining agreement, and nonetheless, as in Myanmar, other places, the employer doesn't fire it. It doesn't follow. This is the case in severance law as well. In most places, there has to be a way to have the power to enforce that.
I mean, I can just add a little bit to that. And, there were a lot of questions in the bundle of questions that you asked. So I'm not sure I'm hitting the right. I'm not sure I'm hitting the right notes. But a couple of things come to mind. The first is that the Bangladeshi Accord is, a great example, and Dina, you point this out so beautifully, is a great example of the ways in which liberal reforms that seem good, that seem to be saving, poor, backwards workers, right, from themselves, right? This is another example of that colonial myth, right? White men saving brown women from brown men, right? So we see this. The Bangladeshi Accord is, one of those great examples. Shamtoli Huq also wrote this great critique about the Accord, where she also argues that while the focus was on, making these buildings more structurally sound, what also got ignored was the fact that gender-based violence continued, right? Continued in these factories. And so that while we were worried about the structure, the physical integrity of the buildings, nobody was talking about sexual harassment. Nobody was talking about violence, personal violence, et cetera, right? And so again, we have to look at all of these things. And there's something ironic for me about making these buildings, which are themselves so oppressive, more secure, right? There's something a little bit ironic about that. And the other thing that I guess I want to say about this question about ethical consumption, and whether or not, we see any room for optimism. Ethical consumption is such a funny thing to me, right? Because what it really is asking, is there a way for capitalism to be ethical? Is there a way for me to participate in the marketplace and feel good? And there's a lot of ways you can do that, right? You can decide that a brand is sustainable, organic, whatever, and shop there. The problem though, again, this is the misunderstanding about what the supply chain is, right? And the way that the supply chain works. Brands often, a couple of things, brands often don't know where their products are manufactured, right? Because of the subcontracting system, the subcontracting system. They lose track, and they lose track on purpose, because that way they're not responsible for whatever's happening at the point of manufacture, right? So that's the first thing. The other thing is that factories often make, and this is the fast fashion fallacy is what I call it in my class. The fast fashion fallacy pins the problems of the supply chain, right? The problems of unethical fashion on the budget market. This again misunderstands the global supply chain, because oftentimes factories will make budget, products for budget brands and products for luxury brands, right? And so the idea that buying a certain brand saves us from an unethical brand doesn't make sense if you understand the full kind of if you're looking more broadly, right, at the way in which the supply chain is organized and the way that it works. And so we've heard this before, you can't buy your way out of this, right? We can't expect capitalism to fix capitalism's problems, which is what ethical consumerism is really at its base trying to do.
Gosh, yes. This is the kind of question I don't know that I have an answer to. It's the what can we do question to, or what can be done. I do want to say, I agree with what Minh-Hà just said about making a building makes more secure is kind of scary, because these buildings, before Rana Plaza, there was a fire 3 months before then in a building that was all locked up for security. That's really, where a couple of hundred workers died because they had to jump out, right? So security is very double-edged that way. I don't know I think there is a lot in individual cases that can be done in contextually specific ways. I don't know. For instance, I think, Bangladeshi laws in Bangladesh, I can see how there is much too close a link between owners of factories and state officials, so that industrial policies, subsidies, all of that are really shaped by this very intimate relationship that's also kind of both visible and invisible. And I could see something like that actually making a difference. But, a difference in, say, the retaliatory dismissal, so that the state would really carry out its task in making sure workers have jobs. But in terms of not getting paid in time, the last slide I showed you is of a factory where the owner was Italian, apparently, and the Italian owner declared bankruptcy and left, which is why, so these factory workers haven't been paid for 7 months or whatever. So the question of who is accountable in that circumstance, it's called Dragon, I think, the factory, or it's A1, I can't remember. We have to really, I don't know that I can give a solution, but I think we really have to study the chain of responsibility, the power dynamics that JJ was talking about. We just have to be a lot more familiar with it. And you're absolutely right. It's not just a force majeure clause, but it's an indication of the power dynamics that produce the contract. It's very, I was just reading something about merchant capitalism in like 19th century colonial India. It's just reminding me, thinking about the garment industry and the contracts that are being made and the conditions of the contracts that are being made, reminded me of merchant capitalism. So I'm not willing to give, I don't know, I'm not the kind of person who can give solutions in that sense. I do think that, I think boycotts are really bad. Boycotts really hurt Bangladeshi workers. I will say that. I'm always very happy to buy Bangladeshi made goods, because if you boycott goods, somebody loses their job, basically is what happens. And you're not changing anybody's, lives. What you're doing is making yourselves feel better. Okay, so hopefully we're beyond that now. I think there's been a lot of critique of that, but that would be what I would say.
Not so sure we're beyond boycotts.
Well, that's true. Well, it depends. I mean, I'm all for certain boycotts. I'm all for signing on.
No, I completely agree. I think
yeah.
we're seeing them at the consumer level. We're seeing them at the sanctions level, where governments are imposing sanctions on, different human rights issues. And
I think those are very dubious.
Sudden withdrawal of companies from countries. But on this notion of feel-good affect, and maybe to probe a little bit more on, the idea of consumer and consumer power, there is a question directed specifically to Dr. Pham, but curious about everybody's take on this. Anonymous attendee asked, I would love to hear Dr. Pham's thoughts on the rise of brands that market themselves as sustainable. For example, Parade, Everlane, Reformation. What has been the impact of these like sustainable and ethical brands on the work that you see?
Everlane and Reformation. Let's talk about Everlane and Reformation, who have made names for themselves, part of their branding as ethical companies. Just in the last couple of months, both of those brands, Everlane and Reformation, on Twitter, workers, employees of these brands have been tweeting about the kinds of racism that they experience, the kinds of ways in which employees of color are not promoted, aren't paid the same, right? And this is at the local level. So this is in US offices, right? The other thing about Everlane and Reformation, and again, you know, they're not unique. This is true of so many brands. They promise transparency, right? But can't offer any evidence, right, of the kinds of transparency they're offering, right? So that is to say, they have names. You know, a lot of these brands now are putting names of factories on their website, or they're talking, you know, they're showing us beautiful videos of you know, the factories where their stuff is produced. Again, the truth is they don't actually know where their products are produced. And it turns out that some of the addresses and some of the names of factories don't exist, right? And so when we go on these websites and we look at, you know, and go, okay, well, I'm going to buy from this brand, and look, they're showing me all this information. What we're doing is we're taking what is basically marketing copy, right? We're taking their marketing copy and saying, this is enough for me to feel good about my purchase. I'm going to buy from this company. That's just that, you know, and Dina, you mentioned this, it's feel good, right? It's feel good consumerism. It makes us feel good. And I guess I just want to add to this, you know, I'll repeat one thing and then I'll add one thing. The repeat is that we have to really, and I think at a consumer level, at a more popular level, we have to really understand what these supply chains are, right? They're long, they're dense, and they're convoluted by design. They're that way because we're not supposed to know, right? A lot of things, right? We're not supposed to know a lot of things, and we're also not, and brands have these, you know, they use subcontractors in order to not be accountable, right? To have that plausible deniability. The other thing that I want to add to the conversation, I guess, and that I've been thinking a lot about as my students and as other people that I talk to ask, well, what is an ethical brand? Is this brand okay? Is this brand okay? Something that I'm starting to think about and that I want to pose as a question back is, why is it that you need to be, why do you need to be told that it's okay, right? Like, why do we need this so badly? Why not grapple with the fact that global capitalism, right, has one logic, one really simple logic, right? And that's to expand, find new markets, right? To find higher profits. And the best way to do that, right? The easiest way to do that is to lower your labor costs, right? And so this extractive logic is inherent, is fundamental to global capitalism, is fundamental to fashion capitalism. And it's not race neutral, it's not colorblind, right? There's, again, I said this in my presentation, we really need to think about what it means, right? That women and girls of color, right, who live in and are from, or are from the global South, are especially almost entirely vulnerable, right, to global capitalism's, racial capitalism's extractive forces. Again, that's by design. That's not an accident, right? And so we need to really grapple with those questions, I think. And it would be great for consumers to be pushing for those questions to be answered, right? Rather than thinking about, well, is Everlane okay? Is Reformation okay? Right? None of them are okay, right? Like in so many different ways, whether it's the way that they treat their employees in their offices in New York City, or whether they how they know or don't know about their suppliers, etc.
I just want to add, that's a very good point about why people need so much reassurance, in a sense, because I think there is a way in which, especially I see in my students, this desire to do good in the world without having to think about complicity. It's the way, one thing I was thinking, well, first of all, I mean, there's a certain naivety that comes from that question about where is this brand good versus is this brand bad, which is that the world is a very messy place. You might say capitalism is a very messy thing. You're never going to get a pure brand. I actually like to buy sometimes if they say it's organic cotton or something, but I'm not going to fool myself and think, oh my God, I've done something good, right? And just never, ever think, no matter what you do, I would say to students, that you're actually doing good. Just do what you need to do. But in terms of, for instance, Bangladeshis get asked this question all the time, what can we do? Well, you know, there are these very interesting tariffs. You can think about, I was just teaching about Iraqi women and whatever yesterday, and how in 2003, Code Pink and a whole bunch of women got together and tried to lobby the US government to not invade Iraq. I actually thought that was a very useful, we were talking about forms of solidarity. We know it didn't quite work, but this is a form of solidarity that took on the logic of war, took on the logic of capitalism and oil, was very open about it. It wasn't the feminist majority, let's save the, you know, Afghan women by bombing them. It was a very different kind of logic, right? So, you know, in the case of Bangladesh, I sometimes tell people, well, you know, if you really want, can, you know, do something for the industry, which may or may not trickle down, that's the other thing. Maybe you could lobby your government to not have a 15% tax on Bangladeshi apparel, and then see if you can redistribute that, right? If you are interested in how global structures work and how local and transnational are connected, do the work, find out. Because there are no cookie cutter solutions. And again, I'm giving you a very specific solution that will only work, you know, well, I don't know if it'll work, but anyway, there you go. That would be my contribution for now.
Maybe just to like take that a little farther also, I mean, this is not, there are all these power imbalanced reasons this is not going to happen, but we have the idea of a carbon tax, right? If you create a bad issue for the environment, you have to pay a tax on it. Like, what if there were a global supply chain tax that the production countries were able to level, that then went back into social contract and all of these things that work so that there is actually a functioning health system and education system and all these things? Because right now, then, you know, the profits are all getting sucked out. I mean, that's a very simplistic way to say it, but we have to ask our questions about the international system, as your point about the Code Pink made. Why is it that a national government doesn't have the power to do these things, which obviously it would want to do for its people? That has to be the starting place.
You know, the prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore often says about prison abolition that we can't ask capitalism to save capitalism, right? We can't, and so I think, you know, the question about ethical consumerism, the question about ethical fashion, is about recuperating in some way capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. And this is where we run into problems, because what happens is if our framework is how do we work within capitalism to make capitalism better, we're doomed to fail, right? Because capitalism does what capitalism does. Capitalism works through exploitation, oftentimes through, or always through, racially gendered, class, colonial exploitation. That's what it does, right? And so to ask it to do something else is just, makes no sense to me, right? One of the things that I am seeing that I do, where there is room for hope for me, right, is that we think about co-op models, right? So rather than have factories work as a company, right, we have workers come together, right, and share in the profits and share in the decision making around how much we're going to charge to make something. What is the production going to be? What are the conditions for production, the conditions for distribution, et cetera? Now, if this seems pie in the sky, it's not. Right? In Los Angeles right now, there's a group called Homework for Health that is doing just this, where workers have created basically a co-op, right? Where they decide, they have meetings, and I had a great conversation with two of the workers there who talk about, we fight about the prices, we fight about, you know, production, we fight about these things, we fight it out together. They come to a consensus, they make a decision, and then they're actually just producing masks right now. But they produce these masks, right? And they decide their timeline, all of these things. So thinking about, you know, thinking about kind of nationalizing factories is one possibility, right? Another possibility is to form worker co-ops, right? And of course, this is not possible under capitalism, right? Because, and this is something that's already been mentioned, but factory owners, local factory owners are union busting, right? And they're doing so because they have a vested interest, obviously, in production, but also because they're getting pressure from, the larger global market to keep their prices low so that they compete against Ethiopia, so they can compete against Vietnam, so they can compete against all these other, countries. And so, again, the push for me is to get away from what, again, prison abolitionists call reformist reforms, right? That kind of take for granted that we have to retain capitalism, right? That take for granted these things. And then to say, well, what else? If we think about, if we think more creatively and if we think more critically, what other models can there be for making clothes? Which I love clothes. I love clothes. I'm not anti-fashion. I'm not, but I am anti-exploitation, and therefore I am anti-capitalism.
I just want to telescope out for a moment into something that's aligning all of these potential solutions, whether they are around co-ops or a particular tax that redistributes for the social good. I think they all orient us towards the ways in which the particular labor issues facing garment workers are really endemic to low-wage women workers across the gamut, and to tie it back into regardless of industry. And so to tie it back into this ethical consumption question, one of the things I study are anti-trafficking projects that aim to rehabilitate sex workers by teaching them how to be garment workers, and then reinscribe them in these new modes of like very menial low-wage labor and sell those products as ethical slave-free goods. And so the connections between sex work, domestic work, garment work are all there in a person's given life. They will have done like all of these jobs. And so I think the more we are able to pull out and think of these systems-based approaches to how we tackle, worker power, I think that they do guide us to better solutions. And then the one other thing I want to say about the Everlane question is, I just think the sustainability, the definitions of sustainability are so easily co-opted. I mean, we're here, this is coming up because we're talking about labor, but if you look at these sustainability statements, there's such a facile bait and switch between talking about workers' rights to talking about the use of water and dyes and the environment and sourcing of, threads and materials. And so I think that when people become a problem and when like labor becomes a problem, it's so easy for these brands to switch to like the eco good and to still like play up that side of the sustainability. And for the consumer who's, flipping through on Instagram, and I want to get to the Instagram question, it's just, you just see the sustainability and like the corporate greenwashing is there and you're getting all the feels that you want, and you just want to buy something. So to build on that, I do want to turn to Tracy McMillan Cotton's question, which I don't understand fully because I don't really know what Instagram Marketplace is that well, but they're right. I would love to hear thoughts on how socio-technical systems and networks interact with and expropriate these global supply chains. For example, the Instagram Marketplace, how the Instagram Marketplace interacts with global racialized labor.
I don't actually understand the question.
Yeah, I looked up Instagram Marketplace, and what I landed on was a very interesting, pitch for people who want to participate in or who want to benefit from this. And it's, I guess, the kind of like highly saturated and very, very quickly and easy accessible way for brands to communicate certain things to consumers, but also to remove like the costs of brick and mortar stores, I think came to mind, because that was one of the huge reasons for why so many people claimed, to shut down orders and things like that during the pandemic, was because they were shutting down all their stores. But does the new like rapid fire consumption maybe on internet platforms change some of the way we think about power in supply chains?
Interesting. I know that I'm not going to answer this question, but I know, for instance, I have a 20-year-old daughter who's not here, otherwise I might have asked her. But she actually, for, I don't know how, but she actually now knows of specific individuals who sell her t-shirts, sell her other goods. That's part of this Instagram market, right? I wonder if that also changes the power dynamics of you don't even need to have, you know, a store, a small little shop in Soho anymore to sell your designer, exclusive designer products or unusual designer products. So it's making the market a little bit more messy for sure. I don't know if it changes power dynamics at all in the end, in the larger scheme.
Yeah, we have a clarification here.
Okay.
Just an example of how we buy goods online and participate in global supplier chains online. I think there's definitely a different kind of accessibility, but also different possibility for the kinds of marketing that the brands are doing. So I think it does tie into the ethical consumption question a bit. I think in addition to the actual like sales platforms, all of these brands have super glossy internet accessible sustainability reports, modern day slavery reports that they are mandated to put together by law that people are downloading from these.
One thing that I guess I can add to this is that in terms of e-commerce, right? The country that is killing it in e-commerce right now is China, right? China is killing it in e-commerce, and we're thinking about Taobao, thinking about Tmall, thinking about all these e-commerce sites. E-commerce consumption, right, is up in Asia. Mobile devices are more mobile consumption, right, is more readily used in Asia, Southeast Asia and East Asia than in the West, I think, right? And so what's happened there is we have this new kind of consumer market that is becoming really powerful. That is a non-white market, right? That's becoming really powerful. And then what's the reaction, and this is something that I discuss in my forthcoming book, the reaction has been to increase intellectual property protections, right? Because the idea is that these brands, and because they're often in Asia, that these brands are pirates, right? That they're not only fashion pirates, that they're pirating designs, but they're also media pirates, right? That they're scouring the internet looking for designs, right? Because that's what Asians do, right? That's the sneaky Asian thing to do. And so what we're seeing as part of, and obviously international IP regulations have to be part of the conversation when we're talking about trade, international trade, but that the kind of the doubling down, right, on particular corporate colonial IP regulations and logics are now happening precisely at a time when e-commerce is up, right? Because the countries that are leading in e-commerce, e-commerce production and also e-commerce consumption are Asia, and the kind of deeply rooted old stereotypes about Asians as copycats, right, are resurfacing again. They never really went away, but are resurfacing again in this kind of e-commerce moment in very particular ways, which is to say that the fashion internet economy hasn't so much changed the kind of racial and gender dynamics of global fashion capitalism, but have intensified them in particular ways. But it intensified them around logics of morality, right? When we're talking about IP. So it's not about market competition, right? But the conversation, the discourse is not about market competition and the fear of, an Asian takeover of the global fashion economy, but about morality, right? So again, it's a question of ethics, and this is part of the ethical fashion. This becomes part of the ethical fashion question of don't buy products from Asia, except Japan is okay, but don't buy products from third world Asia because they're probably made in sweatshops, as if sweatshops don't exist in England and California, et cetera, but also because they're probably knockoffs. Right? They're probably stealing the sales and the intellectual property and whatever creativity of legitimate brands which are, which tacitly means Western and white brands, right? So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's just some of the thoughts that I had about the internet marketplace, not Instagram in particular, but just the internet marketplace.
I would say too, I think part of the reason, well, first I would say mic drop for that. I would say part of the reason why fast fashion or fashion, however broad we create the band, is in crisis is it's a combination of e-commerce and COVID that these brands have not been dealing with. And if we look at the trajectory of many going out of business and the investments of private equity and which ones will survive as hollowed out brands that are fighting to get payments from other places around their their air quotes intellectual property. It's based on like either real estate, like private equity like that cares a lot about real estate and is therefore trying to keep them afloat so the malls stay afloat, so like that works, or the media branding type folks that, much like Toys R Us, there are other retail sectors that have gone through this where the brand is what's important, and then you like change the whole structure below. Hershey's chocolate went through this in the United States. Like this is so as we look at where the money is, I think this is the movement question that we're all grappling with. It's not just that we need to be knowing other folks that work in this sector and how they're fighting it. I mean, and it's not like we need to look at Amazon as if it's a higher up the joint liability, right? Amazon holds H&M accountable, holds the supplier accountable. I mean, Amazon is not trying to just sell H&M stuff on its platform. It's trying to take photos of you and listen to your music and then send clothes to your door before you pick them out, and then you send them back, like that are its own produced stuff. Like that is the vision 10 years from now that Amazon has. And if that's the fight we have, there's many really great movement. There's a lot of really great movement work, the Athena Coalition in the United States and others in other parts of the world that are thinking about that. And that's, I think, leads to the questions Minh-Hà was saying. Like those are a whole set of questions which we as labor activists have to be deeply invested in and prioritizing, in addition to, what's the labor law reform in a particular place.
One last possibility that came to my mind was that the availability of e-commerce and these platforms has emerged as an organizing tool. So workers will on their phones look up how much this shit costs, and this will really, really, really help them as they're advocating for different kinds of like shop floor rights, or to even just like build solidarity amongst themselves to be able to say like, these jeans, this is how much they actually cost and I can see this. And so that's been one silver lining. I think that's been, people have learned how to manipulate access to e-commerce for their organizing goals. We do have a 2-minute warning here, so I just want to give you all each 30 seconds to respond maybe to one question. I want to encourage the audience to look at all the questions. Lots of fascinating things here. I've never heard of the show Sweatshop Dead Cheap Fashion about Norwegian fashion bloggers who are put to work. Sounds horrible and fascinating. But last question from anonymous attendee: how do we transition from witnessing to a praxis of action? How would each of you suggest maybe like one thing that you would like an attendee here today to go out and do? Mine is, please have a look at the documents and the resources that are compiled. The one that I shared from the Federation of Garment Workers Myanmar has links to tons and tons of different campaigns that they're looking for signatures for, or templates for letters to contact different brands, all compiled from them. Okay, I'll turn it over to JJ.
I'm going to take the easy short-term thing because you called me first, and say that when workers who have been retaliated against for any kind of workplace organizing or trying to get reinstated, and there's a campaign about that, help that campaign. Like that is a simple thing that is about the leadership and collective agency of workers in a place. Like a lot of things are confusing, but that is good. So, and then we still do need to sometimes elevate those experiences in order to get them back and get their unions in, leading their unions. So watch for those, look for organizations that are doing that work. And that's like a good signpost for immediate things you can do.
Buy a mask from Homework for Health in Los Angeles. Or if you like me, have too many masks, buy them for stocking stuffers, buy them for whatever, or just donate. Donate to the Garment Worker Center in Los Angeles, donate to workers. Let workers figure out what they need and what they're going to use that money for. Don't assume that you're buying them into their freedom, right? Just give them money, listen to what they say, follow workers, listen to workers, boycott when workers tell you to boycott, because they're doing it. They know what the pressure points are. It's coordinated, and shut up and listen.
Thanks. And lastly, Dina.
Okay, very short. I think I agree with all of these points. Educate yourself, just learn more. Don't, I know it's a horrible thing to say maybe to a lot of students, but actually know when you're going to do something. Don't just jump into it. So know where to donate, and you have all these wonderful sources. I would say, don't just donate to something, just because it's in your face and somebody's asking you for money and you feel good, but learn and then donate. And as others have said, you let the workers lead the way. Don't assume that you know what is good, bad, right, or wrong.
Thank you once again to all of our panelists, to our amazing sponsor, the CSREA, and to all of the attendees. Thank you for this vibrant discussion. As we said in the beginning, we really hope this serves as a launching point for more conversations moving forward. Sending everybody our best wishes at the end of the year. Thank you so much for joining us today.